In 1912, the world watched in horror as one of the greatest engineering marvels ever built, the RMS Titanic, sank beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. More than 1,500 lives were lost in what has been remembered as the deadliest peacetime sinking of a passenger ship in history. The unsinkable Titanic, gone on her maiden voyage. That is the official story. An accident. A tragedy. A fateful meeting with an iceberg. But what if the truth is far stranger? What if the Titanic didn't sink at all? What if another ship, her nearly identical sister, the RMS Olympic, was deliberately sent to the bottom of the ocean instead? And what if this wasn't just an insurance scam, but part of a much larger plan? A plan involving one of the most powerful bankers in American history, J.P. Morgan, and the creation of the central banking system that still controls the U.S. economy today. And if that sounds unbelievable, consider this. 50 years later, another U.S. leader, President John F. Kennedy, challenged that same central banking power. And he, too, would be eliminated. Tonight, we're going down the rabbit hole to connect these pieces. The Titanic, J.P. Morgan, the Federal Reserve, and the assassination of JFK. Coincidences or a pattern? That's for you to decide. The Titanic was built as part of a trio of luxury liners created by the White Star Line, the Olympic, the Titanic, and the Britannic. Of the three, the Olympic came first, launched in 1910. She was a massive ship, just slightly smaller than the Titanic, and quickly entered service as a passenger liner. But there was a problem. In 1911, the Olympic collided with a British warship, HMS Hawke, and sustained heavy damage. Though she limped back to port, repairs were costly, and insurers refused to cover all of it. The White Star Line, already in debt, was suddenly staring down serious financial trouble. Now here's where the theory begins. Some claim that, instead of repairing the Olympic and facing bankruptcy, the White Star Line made a drastic choice: swap the two ships. The Titanic and Olympic were nearly identical, so similar that only experts could tell them apart. What if the damaged Olympic was disguised as the Titanic and then deliberately sunk to collect the enormous insurance payout? Meanwhile, the real Titanic could quietly continue sailing under the name Olympic. Evidence? Conspiracy theorists point to small but telling details. For example, photographs show that the Olympic originally had 16 portholes on one section of her hull, while the Titanic had only 14. Yet, strangely, photos of the so-called Titanic's maiden voyage show 16 portholes, not 14. Did the Olympic set sail under a false name? Survivors also noted inconsistencies. Some described areas of the ship that didn't match what official Titanic blueprints showed. Even the spacing of windows and the layout of the promenade decks seemed subtly off. Were they aboard the wrong ship entirely? Decades later, when divers reached the wreck, they found steel plating with numbers stamped into it, numbers that matched records for the Olympic, not the Titanic. Skeptics argue this was coincidence, or the result of parts being reused during repairs. But to believers, it was the smoking gun. The insurance angle makes sense. The Olympic, damaged from her collision, was no longer profitable. Sinking her, under the Titanic's name, meant White Star Line could collect a massive payout and erase the financial disaster. But what if insurance money wasn't the only motive? What if powerful men wanted certain passengers on that ship and wanted them gone forever? Aboard the Titanic were some of the wealthiest and most influential men in America. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune. Isidore Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store. And John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the entire world. All three of these men were reportedly opposed to the creation of a central banking system in the United States. They believed it would hand too much power to a small group of financiers. They favored hard money policies that kept financial control in the hands of the people, rather than a centralized institution. And yet, all three perished when the Titanic sank. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan, the very man leading the push for a central bank, was supposed to be on that voyage. He had booked a lavish suite, even had his luggage loaded aboard. But at the last minute he canceled, officially because of ill health. Yet days later, He was seen in good spirits in France, enjoying fine art and the company of his mistress. Was it luck? Or did he know something others didn't? With Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor out of the way, there was little to stop Morgan's influence. Just 1 year later, in 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, establishing America's central bank, a move that would forever change the nation's financial system. The sinking of the Titanic, or perhaps the Olympic under her disguise, cleared the stage of some of the loudest critics of centralized banking. To understand why that matters, we need to step back and look at what the Federal Reserve actually is and why it was so controversial. For much of America's history, the country had resisted the idea of a central bank. The first 2 attempts at one had been bitterly opposed, and President Andrew Jackson even made it his mission to kill the bank in the 1830s, calling it a monster that gave too much power to private interests. By the early 1900s, however, America's financial system was fragile. Banks often collapsed, markets were volatile, and there was no central authority to stabilize things. That instability provided the perfect opening for powerful financiers like J.P. Morgan. Morgan was not just a banker. He was an empire in himself. He controlled railroads, steel, electricity, and vast stretches of industry. When financial panic struck, Morgan personally stepped in to organize bailouts, acting like a one-man Federal Reserve before one existed. To many, he seemed like the only person capable of keeping the economy afloat. To others, he looked like a man consolidating power for himself. In 1910, years before the Titanic set sail, a secret meeting took place at Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia. There, under the cover of darkness, a group of bankers and politicians drafted the blueprint for what would become the Federal Reserve System. Attendees included representatives from Morgan's banking empire, along with men tied to Rockefeller and Rothschild interests. The secrecy was extreme. Even the train they took was disguised so reporters wouldn't notice. Why all the secrecy? Because the American public deeply distrusted the idea of a central bank. If people had known that a handful of the richest men in the world were designing it in private, the backlash would have been enormous. Yet just 3 years later, with opposition weakened, the Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law, giving the United States its central bank. Officially, the Fed was meant to stabilize the economy and prevent panics. Unofficially, critics argued it handed control of money creation to private bankers. And here's where the Titanic conspiracy takes root. If some of the wealthiest men in America had been alive to oppose it, would the Federal Reserve Act have passed? Did the icy waters of the North Atlantic conveniently clear the path for Morgan and his allies? Skeptics call it coincidence. Supporters of the theory call it a purge. Now, the story could end there, with Titanic victims and the creation of the Federal. But the rabbit hole doesn't stop in 1913. Because if the Titanic was the beginning of central banking dominance in America, then the 1960s may have been the first serious challenge to it. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy signed Executive Order 11110. At first glance, it didn't look like much. It allowed the U.S. Treasury to issue silver certificates directly, bypassing the Federal Reserve's monopoly on currency. To casual observers, it was just a technical adjustment. But to critics of the Fed, it looked like Kennedy was laying the groundwork to weaken the central bank's control. Imagine if Kennedy had continued down that path, issuing currency independent of the Federal Reserve. It would have fundamentally altered who held the reins of America's money. But Kennedy never got the chance. Just months later, he was gunned down in Dallas, Texas, on November 22, 1963. The official story, of course, is that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But conspiracy theorists have long argued that the assassination was a coordinated effort, and the timing of Kennedy's executive order only deepened suspicion. Just as the Titanic removed opponents of central banking in 1912, Kennedy's death removed the one man in power who appeared ready to challenge it in 1963. Coincidence? Or a century-long pattern of silencing dissent? So, what does all of this have to do with central banking? Quite a lot, according to those who believe this theory. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the Federal Reserve Act was passed. This established the Federal Reserve System, which remains the central banking authority of the United States today. J.P. Morgan's influence in banking and government was immense, and many claim that with his opposition conveniently out of the way, the road was cleared for centralized banking to take hold. To skeptics, the Titanic disaster and the creation of the Federal Reserve are entirely unrelated. After all, legislation is rarely the work of a single event or individual. But for conspiracy theorists, the timing is too perfect to ignore. The sinking of a ship carrying some of the most powerful men opposed to central banking, followed almost immediately by the creation of the Federal Reserve, appears to be more than just coincidence. Now, fast forward to the 1960s. By this time, the Federal Reserve had become a powerful and entrenched institution, woven into the very fabric of American finance. But there was one president, John F. Kennedy, who some believe was willing to challenge it. On June 4, 1963, Kennedy signed Executive Order 11110, which authorized the U.S. Treasury to issue silver certificates directly, bypassing the Federal Reserve. To those who distrust central banks, this was a clear attempt to undermine or even dismantle the Federal Reserve's control over the money supply. Just months later, on November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The official story tells us that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. But many researchers argue that Kennedy's bold move against the central banking system may have sealed his fate. His death ensured that Executive Order 11110 was effectively shelved, and the Federal Reserve continued operating, without interference. Once again, the conspiracy deepens. A century earlier, men who stood against centralized banking allegedly went down with the Titanic. Now, a president who took steps against it was cut down in his prime. The parallels are chilling, and for many, this web of coincidences paints a picture of an unseen hand guiding history to preserve the interests of those in power. But let's step back. Could all of this be nothing more than conspiracy theorists connecting dots where none exist? That's the critical question. Historians argue that the Titanic sank due to poor safety protocols, overconfidence, and a tragic collision with an iceberg. They point out that the Olympic theory lacks hard evidence, relying instead on circumstantial claims about ship design and corporate motive. Similarly, while Kennedy did sign Executive Order 11110, many economists argue that its impact on the Federal Reserve would have been minimal. Yet, the human mind is wired to seek patterns, and in the search for hidden truths, these events appear linked in a way that feels almost too convenient to dismiss. And that's where the allure of conspiracy lies, not necessarily in what we know, but in what might be hidden just beneath the surface. So, what do you think? Was the Titanic disaster truly a tragic accident, or was it part of a much larger plan to shape the financial future of the world? And was JFK silenced because he posed too great a threat to the powerful banking elite? This has been the Rabbit Hole Report. If you enjoyed this dive into one of history's darkest conspiracies, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with others who love exploring the unknown. And remember, once you start down the rabbit hole, there's no turning back. Join us next time as we explore Project Looking Glass, a rumored top-secret technology that some say allows glimpses into the future, or even change the past. Could this be the key to understanding the Mandela effect and why so many of us remember history differently? Don't miss it.